I truly believe that simple things done really well is far better than complex things done sloppy. You have to kind of think about why you're doing what you're doing. And if you can't explain why you're doing it, then you might have an issue. A lot of times I think people with programming think, oh, it's really easy to get really strong. No, it takes time and it takes effort and it takes work. So we've got to kind of keep them grounded on the process.
This podcast is brought to you by Force 8 Coach, your sport, your platform. Welcome back to the 72nd episode of my podcast, Science and Sports. I'm your host, Simon. I'm a former pro hockey player turned to a sports scientist and also currently working for the under-17 German national team. And today I'm joined by Greg Haff. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Simon. How you doing?
I just told it beforehand. I quoted you a couple of times in university for my bachelor's and master's degree. I also heard your name or got in touch because I had the German director of the NSCA on my podcast. I think it was last year. And also you co-authored and contributed a lot to this organization. So for me, it's a pleasure talking to you, having you on. How is your day going?
Oh, it's been a good day. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast and talk about strength and conditioning a little bit in sports science.
Lovely. Very excited for that episode. Before we talk a little bit about sports science, strength and conditioning, can you tell me how you got into this field of sports science?
For me, I grew up in the 80s and we were basically just on the cusp of computer science and, computers, were starting to become something that people played with. I actually started out in computer science and was interested in programming and coding. But I ended up going to university to be a physical education teacher, and East Stroudsburg University had a sub-discipline in physical education called exercise science. And I kind of took some units in that discipline. And because I was a weightlifter, I was really, and an athletics athlete, I was really interested in biomechanics of lifting at the time. And I had a professor named Arnie Golfus, who was a graduate of Penn State's famous water tower, which is where the best biomechanists in the US came from. And another fellow named Professor Frank Pulo, who was a strength and conditioning professor. And I studied with them as an undergrad. And then I was a weightlifter. I got exposed to sports science as an athlete. And I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Mike Stone, Professor Bill Kramer, Professor Kyle Pierce, Dr. Everett Harmon, and Andy Fry, who is now Professor Andy Fry, but at the time he was just Andy Fry. And they kind of introduced me to this world of sports science and strength and conditioning. And I became interested in that. I really wanted to be a strength coach more than a sports scientist. I just really enjoyed strength training. So I actually did my master's degree under Professor Stone, did my coaching under Meg Stone. And in that journey, I kind of got interested in the idea of understanding why performance changes and how we can optimize it, and started to really become interested in science. I still coach, and I still think coaching is central to being a good sports scientist. If you're not coaching, you're not really on the ground, and you can become disconnected from where coaches are. So I coached, but when I did my doctorate, I didn't actually do much coaching. I was mostly training and trying to make the Olympics as a weightlifter, which I failed miserably at. But I did finish my degree. So that was kind of my journey. And I really credit Andy Fry a lot for really getting the introductions to people, because he introduced me to almost everybody I know in the early days. And those people were so wonderfully embracing and supportive of a young weightlifter wanting to learn more about science. And I also forgot Dr. John Garhammer was there as well. And he was an awesome asset when you're doing a biomechanics paper as an undergrad.
So a lot of early influences during your weightlifting career, what made you go from being an athlete towards strength and conditioning and sports science, basically? You just mentioned being a strength and conditioning coach was your, let's say, favorite at the time. Was it due to the fact that you were in the weight room with the athletes, you could be hands-on practically or practice with them or help them grow as individuals and make them better in the off season, let's say, or in the weight room?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would never do is train with my athletes because that takes away from my coaching engagement and my dedicated focus on them. But I enjoyed the coaching. I actually preferred coaching women's sports. One of the reasons I did at the time, strength training for women was relatively new. I mean, it wasn't completely new, but it was something that was an area that had potential growth. And the performance gains that we could stimulate with the female athletes was quite extensive. So I enjoyed the interaction with people, but I also learned like the challenge of writing programs and designing interventions to kind of solve problems or really optimize performance. And that's probably been a central theme of things that I've been interested in is really just optimizing performance in some way. Obviously, strength performance is one of my major interests. And so that's always been a through line through everything I do.
Did you work with athletes in a team sport, or did you work with athletes like track and field where kind of everyone works on their
Yeah.
own, but you're still in a small group together?
So, I mean, probably have the most coaching experience at the collegiate level with athletics athletes, just because I helped my wife when she was an athletic strength coach,
Mm-hmm.
um, and Meg was obviously an athletic strength coach. I do have some experience with women's volleyball and women's soccer or football as well. Um, did very little with American football. I did some, but not as much as I would have liked to. I have worked with some guys that have tried out for the NFL and done more personal training with them. And I did a little bit of work with track cycling, which was
Mm-hmm.
another passion of mine. Is the sport of track cycling is probably one of my most favorite Olympic sports to work with. Um, so I've done some stuff there in multiple places. Mostly training athletes in the United States, but also consulting with teams around international programs around the world.
What is your take on, because I currently work with a pro ice hockey team here in Germany,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm interested in your view on my question coming up. Should a strength and conditioning coach or a sports scientist who does the strength and conditioning in a team sport try to make a individualized workout plan for each player in one team, or should you either try to, let's say, put the guys in different groups of 4 or 5 guys, or just a regular team workout? What's your take on that?
So I think there's a lot of questions that you can ask around that. One is the size of the team. For example, an American gridiron team could have 100 players. So you're not going to have the capacity to write every single
True.
player a completely individualized training program. So that's my first comment. Typically with big groups like that, we would do them by squads or positional groups. So
Mm-hmm.
the bigs or the linemen are going to get a certain style program. The skill players will get a certain style program. Programs will always be individualized by load if you're going to make it relative to someone's individual capacities.
Mm-hmm.
The way I kind of look at it is the core of the program is going to be non-negotiable and across all areas. All athletes. You're going to squat probably, let's say. It's your assistance exercises or your remedial exercises that may be slightly different for groups. A lot of it comes down to management, to be honest. It would be the ideal world would be to have every player have an individual coach and an individual program, but that's just not reality.
Yeah.
So it's either going to be based on positional groups or a core program that kind of touches everything that everyone needs, and then have some remedial exercises based on individual injury profiles or things of that nature. Is kind of how I've always approached it.
Mm-hmm. So, in to sum it up, base training for everyone equal. I mean, your example with, like, let's say American football with 100 players.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good example, because you have guys who are the heavy senders. Let's say, I'm not the football expert, but you have the
Mm-hmm.
quarterbacks or the receivers. Makes total sense, yeah. Because I was thinking about trying to make an like individualized plan for my players, and we have about 25 to 30, ranging from 18 to, let's say, almost 40. But then at the end of the day, it's very hard to do that time wise, and also the amount of stuff we have to work out with isn't really crazy good, and it's not the, yeah.
Well,
So
that's
then
another problem that you have is you're limited by what you have available to you.
exactly.
Well, there are some software packages that can streamline it. For example, Bridge Athletics, which is a program that I like to use.
Mm-hmm.
They actually have you can put alternative exercises. So let's say the back squat is your main exercise, but you could have a remedial, or, for someone who's injured, it could be, the leg press, or, a
Yeah,
trap bar
yeah,
deadlift or something. And then they can make changes on the fly if you have the pre-program. So
yep,
the newer software makes it a little bit easier. I mean, when I did it, we did it on paper. Um, but I think you still have your core exercises that are pretty much necessities, but you also have to kind of think about where your athletes are in their long-term development plan. So a young athlete might need different things than a very old athlete, or have different
exactly.
capacities. So you've kind of got
Yeah,
to you're gonna have some play in there, but I think the base stays about the same.
yeah. The good thing is we use an app as well. So if there is the squat or the deadlift, the
Mm-hmm.
players know already if they're fatigued or if they're injured. They just come right up to me and be like, "Hey, can we swap this and swap that?" Let's say from a squat to a leg press in your example. So that works perfectly fine. But I just wanted to hear your take on doing
Mm-hmm.
individual workouts, whole workouts for each player, or just the main ones and change out like the accessory drills. Yeah. When you look
Mm-hmm.
back at your not career, but at your time as a pure strength and conditioning coach, even with your experiences as a former athlete, former weightlifter, what would you say you missed out during your weightlifting career that you learned afterwards as a sports scientist and a strength coach, which might have been useful knowing earlier in your active career days?
So as an athlete, I didn't really have to think much because Professor Stone coached me, and I just did what he said.
Okay.
Um, but looking back, I would probably say if I had something to do differently, I would probably have maintained more mobility work as part of my training. I do believe that that's probably one of the under trained parts of people's actual programs.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know, as we age, mobility becomes an issue, and when range of motion becomes challenged, injury risk goes up. So I think personally, I would, if I could go back and talk to younger me, I would say keep doing your mobility work, even though Professor Stone didn't prioritize that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest thing I've learned from being a young coach to a more experienced coach is that as a young coach, you're more apt to jump on every new latest craze that hops up on Instagram, or you see someone doing. And I think what you have to do is be centered on some sort of philosophical belief system that guides your programming decisions. I think we have a tendency when we're younger to chase all kinds of things instead of
Mm-hmm.
having, some base philosophy. And then we tend to try to make programs that are overly complex. And I think as I've gotten older and more experienced, I truly believe that simple things done really well is far better than complex things done sloppy. And so my programs are probably very simple, and maybe people would look at them and say they're very rudimentary, but they're extremely effective.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something I've learned in talking with coaches around the world, talking with other strength coaches, and just kind of basically um, simplifying things. Now, the other thing I would say is probably something to consider is that I think a lot of times we as coaches can get locked into some construct. I'm a powerlifting based strength coach. I'm a weightlifting based strength coach. I'm, functional fitness, or whatever you want to call it. I do think we have to think of exercises and things as tools in a toolbox. You might, for example, if you had talked to me in 2010, I would have never ever used bands as a part of a strength training program. I just wouldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
However, in the early 2020s, I came to situations where, doing banded front squats were a necessity for an athlete I was coaching. And so I think you have to kind of be open to looking at things in different ways. Was I using it, to enhance the ground reaction forces? No, I was using it as an external cue in his front squat to make sure he kept his elbows up. Because if he
Yeah.
didn't, the bar, the band would pull him down. So I think you have to kind of look at those kind of things. It is basically keeping things simple, being open to, improving or enhancing your toolbox of exercises, and trying to be more philosophically based as far as what is my belief system. What do you hang your hat on is something that's non-negotiable.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's an important construct to kind of develop as a coach.
How much do you talk to your athletes regarding your workout plans or regarding the stuff you want them to do? Do you explain it to them why we are doing this and go into more details, or just when they come up to you and be like, hey, why are we doing this? Is it useful? Why are we doing that?
Well, I think whenever you're programming for anyone, I think you've got a couple things. One, you have to kind of think about why you're doing what you're doing. And if you can't explain why you're doing it, then you might have an issue. And
Mm-hmm.
the because I told you so answer just doesn't fly. So for me, I think there's different levels of engagement with different levels of athletes. Um, obviously we want to link it to performance or to some sort of specific outcome, because if the athlete can't make that connection, they're probably not going to, dedicate to it. And I think that's important. So you've got to build confidence in them. So really, coaching is relationship building.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think there's a different degree of depth that you will explain things to different athletes. Some athletes just want to know, is it going to work? Others want to know why. And you kind of have to know your people. You don't want to saturate someone who just wants to know the basics with, physiology and biomechanics.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to meet them where they are from a coaching perspective. Um, and so for me, I always, try to make sure my athletes understand the whys of what we're doing, the time frames that we expect things to happen, and I think those are important. A lot of times things are not magic bullets. They're not going to happen instantaneously. It's going to take time, and they've got to be ready for that, because a lot of times I think people with programming think, oh, it's really easy to get really strong. No, it takes time and it takes effort and it takes work. So we've got to kind of keep them grounded on the process, and really talk about what this is as a process, not the outcome, but the process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really is the center of our coaching, is explain why we're doing it and that it's a process and it's going to take time. And I think if we can get them bought in that way, they tend to have better careers. If you only tie them to the outcome, when they don't reach the outcome, then they start to question you.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important parts. What you just mentioned, tell them that it's not gonna change in a week or two, and that's a process. In my case, it starts at the off season beginning, and it's not done when you go into the season. It's still my job, or the responsibility to keep the let's say the strength or the explosiveness we generated or we created in the off season throughout the whole season. And then what I wanted already to talk about, the mobility part you mentioned, to 52 game season, to have them be ready for every weekend, for 2 games a weekend in my case, so they don't get injured, or you prevent it a little bit, let's say. How would you rank the mobility aspect of strength and conditioning, or in strength and conditioning? Would you say mobility is more important than strength during a season, is more important than endurance, let's say?
I don't think you can. For me, strength is always the most important thing, because strong things don't break. So we're either building strength or maintaining strength. If we're not focused
Mm-hmm.
on strength, we're going to lose it in some capacity.
Yes.
But I do believe that mobility is a part of the equation. So, you know, we can build mobility into our ramp warm up, working through range of motion, build motor literacy. And then in our cool down, we can target areas of weaknesses. But I also think recovery can be used on non-training days as activity, to kind of assist the athlete in maintaining, their range of motion. For me, with a team sport, like what you're describing, you're looking at really kind of a mixed model of training, where you have multiple things being trained simultaneously at different points of emphasis. So there's going to be periods where you're dropping your strength development into a maintenance phase, and then you're going to try to transition it into speed and power expression. Flexibility or mobility training, I think, is going to be one of those things that's pretty consistent
Mm-hmm.
throughout the year. It's something that we have to kind of work on. We're seeing with younger athletes nowadays, because we're generally, a sedentary society, we don't have good range of motion, and oftentimes that means that we haven't developed the motor patterns to maximize the benefits of some of the classically important exercises. For
Mm-hmm.
example, squat patterns are really challenged if you have poor ankle and hip mobility. And oftentimes when you have poor ankle and hip mobility, then you have knee issues. So I think we have to kind of consistently build that into our programmatic structures, and make it part of training, not just an optional. If you ever watch a group of athletes, you make the cool down optional, they head for the door as fast as they can without doing it.
Exactly.
And so I think that's some things you have to kind of consider. Not every athlete is motivated to do everything that you want them to do, and sometimes you have to make them do it. Obviously, we want to educate them about why it's important, but we've got to make sure it's completed. So for me, I think, you know, it's really hard for me to define what's important and not important without seeing a global structure of what we're trying to program, and where we're modifying training factors for. You could have two games this weekend that are really easy games. You're going to play
Mhm.
your substitutes the whole weekend, but next weekend could be the game against somebody that we really important game. So we're going to lead into that a little bit differently. So
Yeah.
it comes really down to programming tactics and how we're going to manipulate training variables to kind of optimize the physiological, but also the psychological factors related to that performance.
It's funny that you mentioned the aspect with the optional cooldown, because I wanted to ask that to you right away now. Uh, I hope I pronounce it right. You worked in collegiate level, I think you said.
Mm-hmm.
I'll work with a pro team since 4 years, I think it is. And what's your take on doing something mandatory in a in a pro stage? Because I mean, in collegiate level, if the coach says you have workout, is workout. Same for me. We got 2 or 3 workouts at the moment. No, not anymore, but during the season, we try to aim for like 2 high quality sessions coming up for our games. Those are mandatory. But same thing, what you just mentioned, if you tell them, hey, there's an optional mobility class, it's an optional recovery day, the attendance isn't the greatest.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in collegiate level, it's different. As in pros, I feel like, but what's your take on that?
Well, there's a lot of different ways you could look at it. There's, team dynamics. You need to create a culture where athletes hold each other accountable, and if you can create
Mm-hmm.
that culture in a team, that team will generally be a successful one. So with the pro sports, it's a little bit different. They're supposed to be adults. They're supposed to know what they're supposed to do, but they don't always do what they're supposed to do. I think it just depends on the culture that the head coach has developed. If the head coach creates a culture where you have these non-negotiables or, bargaining kind of thing, then you can do that. Again, it comes back to communication and really kind of convincing them that this is something they want to do and that they need to do to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
My wife, coached in professional sports as a strength coach. She always had mandatory cool downs, and she had the captains run them. So it was
Mm-hmm.
put on to the captains to actually do the actual leadership of that. So it was the group starts together, the group works out together, and the group finishes together. And then I think that's an important part of building team dynamics, and so it's a tricky one. Team dynamics are probably sometimes more important than the actual training, because if the team
Yeah,
dynamics don't work, it doesn't matter how fit and great you are.
yeah, that's true. That's a good point, because if you don't have someone, or if you see each other, let's put it this way, for in my case 8 or 9 months on a daily basis, and I mean, you know it, I don't have to tell you, you don't need to be best friends with anyone, but or with everyone, but you just have to be hold each other accountable, and that's, I think, one of the main goals that makes or breaks a team then at the end.
Yeah, because you have to have a shared goal. I mean, if your shared
Yeah.
goal is to win, then you've got to hold each other accountable to that goal. You don't have to go home and share Christmas cards or anything, but when it comes to competition, you need to actually kind of ensure that you're doing what needs to be done so the team can win.
And be then on the same page for the same goal you have. Yeah.
Yep.
I have one more segment, and I think I mentioned it earlier in the episode, maybe beforehand, and it's about your role in developing and writing materials for the NSCA. How
Hmm.
did that come about? How did you get started into that? How did everything start on that end?
So I was very lucky. I studied with Professor Mike Stone between 1993 and 1996, and probably, he changed my life in many ways. And I was very lucky. He was the president of the NSCA when I was his graduate assistant, so I really got to
Mm-hmm.
peek behind the curtain a little bit. And he was very adamant that all of his grad students needed to be members of the NSCA, and we needed to, go to conferences, and we need to be certified and accredited and all those things.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been a member since something like 1993, 92, something like that. I was first introduced to the NSCA in 1988 by Professor Frank Pulo. I got a copy of Husker Power and the first editions of NSCA's journals. And
Mm-hmm.
it was something that was really interesting to me because I'd always been interested in strength training. My father, started me with strength training when I was 11 years old. And so studying with Mike, NSCA became part of our culture. We basically published in the journals. We went to conferences. It was just part of what we did. And then when I got my PhD in '99, I was very lucky. Professor Stone and Dan Wathen, who was a former past president at NSCA, nominated me for the NSCA's research committee. And
Mm-hmm.
that was a really big honor as someone who literally just got their PhD like a week before I got nominated, to get nominated and actually make it onto this really important committee within the NSCA. And I was on that committee for about 6 years. And that opportunity really was great because I got to meet a lot of sports scientists or scientists within the strength research space. And that opened doors. And one of the things that I always tell students is an argument I had with Meg Stone, actually, when I was a young grad student. NSCA costs money. It costs money to travel there. It costs money to stay there. And not always do we have money as graduate students. Meg Stone told me that it was an investment in my future and that I needed to find ways to make it work. And I'm glad I listened to her because my whole career has really come up through the NSCA from, you think about it, the organization was founded in 1987. I've been a member since like 1998, 99, 89. So I've been there for a long time. I was lucky enough to get on the editorial boards of JSCR. Bill Kramer put me on that. Jeff Chandler put me on the editorial board for Strength and Conditioning Journal. And when it really launched for me was when Professor Stone's father passed away, and he needed to do a talk on periodization at an NSCA periodization summit, and he couldn't go. And they asked him, who could give your talk for you? And he said, I could. And so I actually flew out on a day's notice to the NSCA headquarters to give this talk on periodization for Professor Stone. And I guess I did a good job because I was then a keynote speaker that year at the NSCA conference, and I talked about strength and endurance training for cyclists. I got a book deal at that conference to write a book, like a lab manual, and then
Mm-hmm.
eventually I got to write with Professor Bompa, and then the rest is kind of history. Um, soon after that, I got on the board of directors as a board of director. I put my hand up and got elected and was vice president. Um, so really it was about being involved, being lucky enough to have mentors who were involved, who kind of dragged me along and introduced me to the people that I need to know. I threw my hand up for the presidency in 2015, I think it was, only because they kept calling and asking, and I really never thought I'd get it, and then I ended up getting it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, and I've really I enjoyed that experience. I enjoyed the friends I've made from it, the countries I've gotten to see, and a lot of the initiatives we were able to really to build. And so I got selected to do the Essentials book in for 2016. Roger Earl, who's my acquisition editor with Human Kinetics, really big supporter of me as a person. I've known Roger for 20 something years, and he's been the acquisition editor for all the books I've done. And he really helped promote me with that. And then the NSCA, myself and Professor Triplett, we've been around a long time. We've worked together for over 30 years. And we've just wrapped up the the fifth edition, but it's the second edition that we've done. And I think one of the reasons we've been successful is we both have a tie to the history. We've been around for a long time. We've studied with the icons, both of us, and um, we're very accepting of the past and the fact that we need to honor it, not just throw it away. There's, one of the beauties of the NSCA is that most of the founding members in the science community are still alive and still attending. That
Okay.
is very, very, very unique. It's not going to be like that forever. It is now. And because of that, you have to have some reverence to the past because they're still here.
Mm-hmm.
You have to. There's a little bit of a delicacy to actually putting the essentials out. You don't want to just throw things away just because it's not the latest greatest trend. It's kind of a
Yes.
slow moving kind of process. So it's been a great honor, but you have to earn it. I didn't just get it. I had to work hard and have my own research career and build my own programs. And they don't just give you those opportunities. You have to establish yourself in order to do that. And I'm blessed to be able to do it with one of my best friends, in Professor Triplett, and it's a lot of fun.
What goes into creating, let's say, the best certification out there?
Well, I mean, the process is quite complex. I mean,
Yeah.
so the original process was started by our founder, Boyd Epley, who is still, around and still someone you can engage with and talk with. And it's great to
Mm-hmm.
spend time with Boyd. The 50th anniversary is coming up in 2027. So it's a really unique time. The essentials is a hard one to really put together. It's because there's so many stakeholders involved, because it underpins the certification committees involved, because it underpins, one of the biggest products that human kinetics has. Human kinetics has a say in it, then the NSCA has a say in it, the board of directors has a say in it, and it's a really complex task. And so it's difficult to make wholesale changes. You can make, this fifth edition probably has the most changes. We've really pushed the boundaries and added things about overtraining and women,
Mm-hmm.
and we really decided that we wanted to make a substantive update, and Travis and I lobbied for that for about 5 years, really. And so we've done that. And the issue with the certification is, the certification was really open before, and it was for everyone to get, and it's done what we hoped it would do as an organization. Where the organization in 2018 started to pivot to accrediting schools, which they're still in that process of working to, and there's a lot of challenges for that. And my presidency, we started that process. Um, I think the issue really becomes that at times, because of the size of American sports and American football and stuff, it can swamp the system a little bit. And I think it's really important that we take a more global lens and look at the international market as well as the domestic market that the NSCA serves. And realize that we have international affiliates all over the world that have different needs and different perspectives. And I think we can learn from each other. And I've always been a proponent of that. Um, you know, I think that's important. But I do think the organization has to stay true to its roots of strength and conditioning, core philosophies, and core principles. It's really easy to deviate from those principles. And I think when you do that, you start to see membership decline and interest in the organization decline. And I think a lot of people sometimes make that mistake. And I think understanding where the organization has come from is central. Um, and I was lucky. Like I said, I was with Professor Stone when he was a president in the 90s. I was a president in the 2010s. And that those lessons were very useful to me. Um, and we're still engaged. A lot of we have a past presidents committee that we still give advice to the current president. We also are engaged in a lot of behind the scenes activities.
I have one more question, when you don't mind, about you writing that book. When you write something that is probably read by 1,000 of coaches, students, and people who are attending the congresses, let's say, for example, how do you balance the scientific accuracy and the let's real world usability in the weight room? Because I think it's a hard task for you to write, and then also sometimes you have something that is in theory works fine, but then you don't have the space, you don't have the equipment or the budget for that to work.
Well, I think you have to think about, like, any textbook is a learning reference. It's not like a, you know, plug and play cookbook, I guess.
Mm,
The challenge with Essentials is it's an edited book. So, there's things in there I don't agree with. 100% don't agree with. But because it's done by committee, it's consensus driven. So, all the new updates are voted on by committee. Travis and I, have some say, but ultimately we don't always get exactly what we want, because it's the NSCA's book. It's not my book.
mm,
And so from that perspective, that's a challenge. Like, there are definitely things in there that I don't agree with, and that's okay. Because really, what we have to do is provide references and resources for students, and coaches. But we also have to provide, as professionals, we need to train people to think critically. We need train people to be able to make decisions for themselves. Now, one of the things I said earlier in our conversation was that I do believe that sports scientists need to coach. And I think that's a critical part of their development. And I do believe they need to learn to look at things not only from a scientific perspective, but through a coaching lens.
Mm-hmm.
I'm blessed. I'm married to an elite super coach, and she's very apt to tell me when my science isn't going to work in the real world. She will tell me very quickly. So I tend to try to always, engage coaches in the research that I do and explanations. That doesn't mean that when we write something that we might write a theory that, we find out doesn't work. And I'll use an example. So I wrote a periodization chapter in the original tactical strength and conditioning book that the NSCA put together. At the time I thought it was spectacular. I was like, this is great. In my journeys over the last 15 years, I've had the opportunity to work in, different areas of defense, and had to change my thinking a little bit about how to train tactical operators. And so the new edition has a little bit of a different lens to it, because that's part of science. It evolves. Now, some of the things that we talked about in the original chapter are still there, and we still agree with them, but we had to change some things as we evolved. And I think that's important. But what caused us to evolve? Well, that was being in the situation where we're working with these people, having to make tactical decisions through the frame or reference of science. So the science is never disconnected. We have to make decisions and prioritize things. So I think it's always a challenge, and you will always have people that will complain that it's not not feasible or not practical, or but we try to get as close as we can. And I will say that I did learn from Professor Stone that all grad students should coach, they should train and compete and learn science. And when I say train and compete, he likes them to train and compete in strength sports.
Yeah.
And that's so that they understand how it feels to do a lot of these training activities.
So that's also your number one advice for upcoming athletes who want to take the route of strength and conditioning to sports scientists, to work in the gym with the athletes.
Yeah, you have to coach. If you don't coach, you won't learn how to communicate with them. One of the biggest problems we find with sports scientists in both the military space and within the sporting space is they come in and come from a frame of reference that has no understanding of what that frame is. For example, when I worked with track cycling, when I was coaching strength training track cyclists, I went and raced on track cycling. I decided that to understand what they're experiencing, I would race as well. So I raced for 2 seasons on top of coaching. I also went and got a coaching license for cycling. So I'm not only, I at the time I was a track cycling coach and a strength coach and an academic. So I wanted to learn everything I could, but I also wanted to learn how it feels. And what I did is the athlete that I was training, I made him my coach on the track. And so that was a great, we built a really strong relationship that way, because he was a Canadian, Olympian. And so I think that's important. Any sport that I work with, or any environment, like when I worked in defense, I actually did some of the defense stuff. So I could feel it and understand it. And so I think that's important. It gets harder as you get older to do, but I do think it's important. And it helps build that common language. A lot of it, I think, is because, I'm lucky. I came from a generation where sports science students and coaches were in the same classrooms. Sports science or exercise science has evolved and split away from physical education and coaching. And I really think that's done a disservice to the profession, because, we're much more into, biochemistry, cell signaling, and all that advanced stuff. But that really has taken us down the mechanistic path and away from the applied path, because those mechanistic approaches don't always resonate or don't always connect in the coaching environment.
Okay. So go into the weight room, coach on do your on-hand work, let's put it this way. And I think it's a good point that you said, even if you get older, you can still do the sport of the athlete you're maybe coaching. You don't have to be the best, or you don't have to be better with them, but just to understand how it works and what's important in it, for sure. Do you think it's mandatory? One more question before we wrap it up. Do you think it's mandatory for someone to do their sport, or it just makes it easier, right?
don't think anything is mandatory in life. I mean, there's some great coaches that never did the sport.
Mm,
Some of the greatest coaches ever, didn't play the sport. Um, but I do think it helps build credibility.
mm-hmm,
I mean, I'll use like my wife, for example. She was, an elite All-American javelin thrower, discus thrower, excuse me, not javelin, All-American volleyball player, and then on the national weightlifting team. So when she would go into an environment to coach as a strength coach, she had a presence.
mm,
She could do things, and they could see it. I mean, she's older now, and she still has a presence.
yeah,
And I think that's important. Doesn't mean you have to be the strongest in the room or the biggest. It means you just need to be able to demonstrate things effectively and efficiently.
mm-hmm, yeah,
I am seeing a really disturbing trend in strength and conditioning students over the last maybe 5 to 6 years, where they are not very physically capable, and they want to just show videos and not actually demonstrate things themselves.
mm-hmm,
That is a problem, because really athletes don't respect that. They want
yeah,
to see you at least move. I know, for example, a good friend of mine, Jimmy Radcliffe at the University of Oregon. He's older than I am, and I've known him for a long time, and the man moves well. He moves better than I move. And he came to Australia to do an NSCA conference, and the people's jaws were hitting the floor about how he moved. And I'm
mm-hmm,
sitting there going, "Wow, he slowed down," but they thought he was lightning fast. So I think you have to I think it's important.
mm-hmm,
And part of being the student of the sport is learning the sports movements as well.
yeah. Greg, it was a pleasure talking to you. I would like to wrap it up now, but before we
Yeah.
go, where can people find more about you and about your work?
So I'm on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn, um,
Mm-hmm,
but I also have a Substack. So I publish things on Substack. It's been something I've been doing recently for about a month now.
mm-hmm,
And so I put out articles that are basically translating science into coaching kind of concepts. And so
okay,
we're doing that. We're building out some things related to programming and things of that nature with other business kind of activities. So I'm out there. I'm pretty easy to find. I will be at the NSCA conference in New Orleans if the jet fuel doesn't run out,
mm-hmm.
and we can actually get there. But we're around.
Okay. My listeners already know the deal. I hopefully don't forget to put some links in the description. Got noticed that I forgot it a couple of times. I'll make sure that I put it for this one, especially. And to wrap it up, one more question on my hand. I asked
Mhm.
my colleague I told you before who lives in Australia, how is
Mhm.
life with all those spiders, with all those venomous animals down there?
I haven't seen any really, to be honest. It's no different than living anywhere else. It's the only thing, it's warm here pretty much year round. It doesn't get that cold where we live in Perth. It's a wonderful country to live in. I've enjoyed my 15 years here. We've had a lot of fun doing a lot of
Mm,
different things. The only challenge is we live on the other side of the planet in the most isolated major city in the entire world.
that's
So it
true.
takes 20 hours to get anywhere.
Oy. Okay. Then Greg, thank you so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure. We made it
You're
work
welcome.
with the time difference. It was a really great episode, and thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Take care, Greg. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the podcast, leave a rating or comment, and share it with someone who loves sports science. And for more content, follow me on Instagram at science_in_sports_. See you in the next episode.